If Joe Biden had signed off on those documents, what are we going to do about this? Not just NATO provided weapons, it's NATO targeted weapons. As I don't know how, if people don't understand, Keir Starmer brought with him the documents. The target list, part of that target list would have been executed that night. Here are my concerns about the danger of nuclear war. But Joe Biden's not done. As Dennis Small said, he is going to meet with Zelensky at the United Nations General Assembly debate, where they're going to talk about how to make this happen. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you, Dennis Small, for your outstanding presentation. In fact, I should probably just yield the floor back to you because you were hitting everything perfectly. We are, I've been accused a lot lately of being an alarmist. Some people say, well, you're irresponsibly engendering fear. But I will say right now that if you are not scared to death, then you're the problem. I'm not the problem. If nuclear war and the prospects of nuclear war don't scare you, I don't know why you're here in this forum, and I don't know what you're trying to accomplish. There literally is no other issue today. No other issue today. I'm going to just emphasize that again because I know people out there feel strongly about very many other issues. There's no other issue today that's more important than preventing a nuclear war, and we almost had one last week. I don't know how, if people don't understand, Keir Starmer brought with him the documents, the target list. If Joe Biden had signed off on those documents, the target list, part of that target list would have been executed that night. British technicians are already in Ukraine loading target data onto the Storm Shadow missiles. These missiles right now are being used against targets in Novorossiya, in the former Ukrainian provinces of Lugansk, Kherson, Donetsk, and Zaporizhia. Why? Because Ukraine, and again, it's right to say, they say this is our territory. Okay. Crimea, they say it's our territory. Okay. That's why Russia is not responding by threatening nuclear war when Storm Shadow missiles are used against those targets. This is a debatable point. Russian territory, however, outside of those 5 named areas, is Russian territory. It's sovereign territory, unquestionably sovereign territory. And any effort to use NATO-provided weapons, and it's not just NATO-provided weapons, it's NATO-targeted weapons. As Dennis said, this isn't about just saying, okay, we'll fire a Storm Shadow off. What's the difference between that and any other weapon system Ukraine has? Ukraine has had very good success using long-range drone systems and striking targets deep inside Russia. What's the difference between a Ukrainian drone system and a British or American-provided missile? The Ukrainian drone system is a Ukrainian weapon system directed by the Ukrainian government, and Russia will hold the Ukrainian government to account using whatever means it chooses to do so. This is the nature of conflict between two nations, and Russia and Ukraine are in a state of advanced conflict. Ukraine thinks of it as a war. Russia calls it a special military operation. That's a matter of semantics. They are in conflict with one another. NATO claims not to be a party to this conflict. And yet, when NATO provides weapon systems that can only strike targets when the targets have been processed by NATO-only entities. That's what people need to understand here. It's not just a matter of programming a Storm Shadow missile. There is an element in Europe, part of NATO, that absorbs American intelligence information, overlays it with American mapping information, and turns it into the data necessary to strike a target. That data is loaded into the Storm Shadow. Because the Storm Shadow communicates with GPS, it doesn't do it on a commercial GPS signal. That's just that's just a single channel. It can be jammed. It does it using the military channels. That's two channels. They're encrypted. They're encrypted by the United States using American encryption technology that has to be loaded into the systems by Americans, not by Ukrainians. Ukrainians are not cleared to operate this level of cryptographic keying material. So when a storm shadow is fired against a target inside Russia, it is literally being targeted by NATO. NATO is approving of the target and facilitating the use of this weapon system against the target. That means that NATO is a literal party to the conflict. And yet Keir Starmer wanted Joe Biden to sign off on this, to say, allow us to use this American intelligence so that we can strike targets inside Ukraine using the Storm Shadow missile. This is an act of war. And it's something that, had Keir Starmer signed off on, would have been implemented that night. It's not something that's going to happen down the road. It would have happened that night, Friday the 13th. And on Saturday the 14th, we would all have been dead. That's the point I'm trying to make here, people. It's not a joke. It's not a game. The Russians are not bluffing. Vladimir Putin made this clear on Thursday when it became evident that the United States was having this meeting with Starmer in the White House. And he basically said that if you do this, you will be a party to the conflict and Russia will have to act accordingly. Dmitry Peskov, the spokesperson, reiterated this point and said the president has made this quite clear, but not clear enough because they still had the meeting. On Friday, the UN ambassador, or the Russian ambassador to the United Nations, in front of the Security Council in session, reiterated this point, that it will be a declaration of war if the United States and Great Britain enable Ukraine to use NATO-provided weapons to strike Russia. The Russian ambassador to the United States took it a step further. Anatoly Antonov said, if you think that a nuclear conflict will be limited to Europe, basically acknowledging that if this happens, Russia will use nuclear weapons against Europe. If you're an American and you think it will be limited to Europe, think again. We will strike you. You're playing with fire. Don't let your fingers get burned. Now, when he said this, it sent shockwaves through the American community. Former government officials, and if you know anything about how the establishment works, we have a whole host of former government officials who advise, who are in have connectivity with the current administration. They called Anatoly Antonov, and you have to ask yourself, why didn't the government call? Because we don't have connectivity with the Russians anymore. I was at the Russian embassy on Friday night. I was there at the invitation of Anatoly Antonov. I was there to attend a concert performance, a piano concert performance of Rimsky-Korsakov and other Russian composers, as part of Anatoly Antonov's effort to demonstrate to the American people the culture of Russia, to help detangle the Russophobia that has spun its web around the Americans. I've never seen the ambassador so distracted and so concerned. This was his big moment. He has been working for months to bring this concert in, to make this demonstration. And yet at this moment, his mind was elsewhere. And now I know where his mind was. He was uncertain whether or not he would live the day. He was uncertain what the United States would do. He had done his duty in articulating this, though, to the various former government administration who called the Biden administration and said, he's not bluffing. This is as real as it gets. If you sign this document, we will be at war with Russia, and the war will be a nuclear war. I don't know if you guys are hearing what I'm saying. We all almost died on Saturday. If you read Annie Jacobson's wonderful book, Nuclear War: A Scenario, it's a work of fiction, but it was written after consulting with former nuclear war planners, people who were in the system, who understood how nuclear war is fought. They understand how things are going. You know how long it takes for the world to end in a nuclear conflict? From start to finish, from the beginning of the initiation of events that lead to the first launch of a nuclear weapon until all life on Earth is forever destroyed, either instantly or things have been set in motion for the long, lingering death. 72 minutes. That's all it takes, ladies and gentlemen. 72 minutes. What are we going to do about this? This is the existential question of our time. What are we going to do about this? I think most people that are in attendance here share my fear, my concerns about the danger of nuclear war. But Joe Biden's not done. As Dennis Small said, he is going to meet with Zelensky at the United Nations General Assembly debate, where they're going to talk about how to make this happen. What is needed to make this happen? The European Parliament, as Dennis said we want this to happen. Why? Because Europe believes that Russia is bluffing. Europe believes that Putin is bluffing. Europe doesn't believe that Russia would pull the trigger. I've been studying Russia my entire life. First as the Soviet Union, later in the decade of the 90s, and I've been watching Vladimir Putin very closely for 25 years. I've had the privilege of visiting Russia twice in the last year. I would have gone a third time, but the U.S. government stopped it. One of the reasons why they stopped it is because of the insights that I have gained by visiting Russia and speaking with Russians, Russian officials, Russian military officers, etc. I will say this: Russia doesn't bluff. Russia understands what war is more than anybody in the West does. Russia understands the sacrifices necessary to sustain a nation in times of existential crisis. And the Russians are not willing to allow NATO, the United States, or any of its proxies to put the Russian state at risk, to put the Russian nation at risk. And allowing Ukraine to use long-range NATO-provided systems targeted by NATO isn't just an extension of the Ukrainian warfighting capability. It gives NATO a preemptive strike capability. This is what people don't understand. Because if NATO can use Ukrainian weapons to take out strategic targets inside Russia, and then follow that up with a NATO strike, conventional in nature, designed to decapitate Russian leadership, and then follow that up with a wave of low-yield nuclear weapons, which are now integrated into the American arsenal and a part of our nuclear deployment plan. I don't know how many people understand that the former commander of United States Strategic Command, in speaking to Congress, said, "I prefer preemptive nuclear strike." Listen to what I'm saying. I prefer preemptive nuclear strike. That's his preferred way of doing war. Preemptive nuclear strike. And now you're a Russian listening to that, and you're watching NATO and the United States give Ukraine the ability to launch the first wave of preemptive action under the guise that it's just Ukraine, paralyzing the Russians so that the second wave, a NATO wave, comes in, decapitates, followed by a preemptive nuclear strike. And you're the Russians saying, what do we do about this? And what they do is they say we have to draw a line. And the line has been drawn. They are not bluffing. This is existential in nature. We have an election coming up in the United States. It's turning out to be one of the most important elections of our time, not because of abortion, not because of immigration, not because of the economy, not because of anything that everybody else has talked about, but because if we make it to the election, because there's a good chance we won't. There's a good chance we won't make it to next week. There's a good chance we won't make it to tomorrow, depending on decisions that are being made. But if we make it to the election, the person we elect is going to be the person that is either going to take us into World War III, a general nuclear strike, or is going to resolve the issue. Right now, there's only one candidate that's injecting the threat of nuclear war into the political debate. And that, of course, is Donald Trump. There's a lot of people out there that say they could never vote for Donald Trump. That's your prerogative. But if you don't want to vote for Donald Trump, at least exploit the fact that he's injected something into the political debate and make your candidate of choice respond. We have to inject a discussion about the dangers of nuclear war into the American political debate at this election. It must become the existential issue of this election. No other issue matters, because if there is a nuclear war and we're all dead, no other issue matters. We can't solve the issues of abortion, immigration, the economy, and other things else if there is no country, if there is no world. We have to stop this nuclear war. We all almost died last week. And again, I just want to make that point. If it weren't for some brave statements made by Russian government officials, from the president to the two ambassadors, Biden would have signed off on Keir Starmer's documents. Storm Shadow missiles would have been launched against targets inside Russia, and Russia would have responded, beginning the cycle of escalation that leads to a general nuclear conflict. We need to inject sanity into the political discourse. We need to put pressure on Jill Stein to respond to the op-ed that was written by RFK Jr. and Donald Trump Jr. and published in The Hill magazine, which put on the table for the first time from a campaign the necessity of negotiating into the conflict of Ukraine and linking the conflict in Ukraine to the danger of nuclear war, because they are linked. We need Jill Stein to commit. We need Kamala Harris to commit. We need this to become a political issue. And once it becomes a political issue, that puts pressure on the Biden administration not to engage in any precipitous activity that would generate a nuclear conflict. On 28 September, we're having a rally in Kingston, New York. It's the beginning of what I call Operation Dawn. Operation Dawn are just four simple questions I ask the American people. What will you be willing to do to save democracy, to save America, to save the world, by making your vote count in November? And what you need to do is just that. Make your vote count. Don't give your vote away. Make a candidate earn your vote. And the issue that you need to emphasize for them to earn is, what is their strategy for preventing a nuclear war? What is their strategy for bringing about peace with Russia? What is their strategy for promulgating disarmament, reintroducing disarmament into the political dialogue between Russia and the United States? Right now, only one side has put something out there. We need all sides to do. We need this to become a matter of national discussion, national debate, and then and only then might we dodge this bullet. Thank you very much for letting me speak. Yeah, well, let's look at it. On September 6th, Lloyd Austin, who's the Secretary of Defense, was in Ramstein, Germany for, I think, the 24th iteration of the Ukraine Contact Group. This is where the United States and its NATO allies, European supporters, meet with Ukrainians to discuss Ukrainian military priorities and how they're going to be met through the infusion of weapons and money, etc. And Zelensky attended this and made a very forceful pitch for the United States to sign off. And Zelensky was hopeful that Lloyd Austin would give his permission. Indeed, much of the press coverage was that this was the place where Great Britain and the United States were going to sign. But as you've said, Dennis, the Pentagon understands war. I know we don't like the military industrial complex. We have little respect for $1 trillion budget and all this kind of stuff. But the professionals in the Pentagon, and there are some, understand war and understand the realities of war, and they understand where the Russians are coming from. And so Lloyd Austin was not willing to sign off on that. And he said, there's no single weapon that's going to solve this thing. This is going to have to be negotiated. That was not the message Zelensky wanted, who immediately picked up his phone and called the British, who called Tony Blinken. And Tony Blinken and his British the foreign secretary counterpart, Mr. Lammy, I believe his name is, took a train into Kiev, where they met with Zelensky. And again, the expectation was Blinken was going to make the big announcement. But the Pentagon again intervened and said, no, there are consequences to this. So Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, began a PR campaign. First thing we saw is, I think it was 15 former British officials and generals came out and said, the Russians are bluffing. This is a big bluff. Don't be scared of the bluff. The Ukrainians did that. And Starmer flew to the White House, where he was told by the National Security Council, Biden was ready to sign off, that Biden agreed, shared that this was all a bluff. So I think the big point here is that we're not out of the woods, because we had the Pentagon, who are the warfighting guys, say there will be consequences, dire consequences, that of giving a green light to the Ukrainians to use this. The State Department chose to override the Pentagon. The Pentagon was able to stop it. A foreign government sought to override it, almost succeeded. And it wasn't the Pentagon that stopped it this time. It was the Russians that stopped it.
Right.
But what happens when in these discussions they say the Russians are just bluffing? Oh, you Pentagon guys are just too scared. You're too nervous nillies. The Russians aren't going to use nuclear weapons. I mean, you see this all the time. I see this everywhere. The Russians would never use nuclear weapons. Well, even Anatoly Antonov said a nuclear war must never be fought, can never be fought. But there is a Russian nuclear doctrine, and the doctrine is very specific about that which would trigger a Russian nuclear response. And one of it is a conventional strike by NATO, which represented an existential survival question for Russia. And again, the scenario that I laid out, where Ukraine is used as a proxy to initiate a sequence of events, the Russians view this with such concern because, again, remember, I mean, everybody here is familiar with Ray McGovern, a brilliant former CIA analyst. Ray has been saying this for some time now, that the Russians, the red line that Russia made with Biden even before the special military operation began, going back to December, was you can't put missiles in Ukraine. And Biden said, oh, well, we're not going to do that. But then Biden backed off because the strategy of the United States and NATO has always been to put these missiles in Ukraine. Why? To launch the very kind of sequenced preemptive assault that I just described to you. Because the commander of Strategic Forces of the United States said that his favored course of action with the Russians is preemptive nuclear strike. This isn't a joke. The Russians read this, they hear this, they know this. This is the danger we face. Russia's always said this is a red line. There's some in the Pentagon that are respecting this. What we need to do is help amplify this, but now we come to one of the fundamental problems. The FBI knocked on my door on August 7th. They came in and seized my electronics right here in this wonderful little studio I call my workspace. Why? Because they're trying to make the case that I was an agent of the Russian government. Not the spy versus spy kind of agent, spying, because I'm not in the government anymore. I can't spy. No, I'm an agent of disinformation. I'm somebody there who's trying to undermine the election by spreading and propagating Russian disinformation. And I believe the FBI, who may or may not be watching this panel today, either directly or indirectly, because they've been in my house, so I assume that they're monitoring everything I say. And the FBI might say, well, what I'm doing right now is simply just Russian propaganda, Russian disinformation. This is the problem we face, because in trying to oppose bad policy, which is the duty and responsibility of every American citizen, I don't know why the FBI thinks that it's unpatriotic to try and disrupt an election. The mere fact that I pick one candidate or the other is disruptive, because I'm saying I support this over this. But we are in a situation now where the U.S. court system, backed by the Department of Justice, has promulgated an official definition of what they call disinformation. Disinformation isn't about the facts. Disinformation is that which deviates from the official narrative. And so now we have people like Hillary Clinton who are trying to criminalize people who are engaged in disinformation. That means that the mere fact that we speak out and challenge official policy somehow puts us at odds with the powers that be. So we're fighting a two-front war here. We're fighting a war where we have to explain to an American audience the importance of standing up to bad policy, and we have to fight a government that says that very act of explaining is criminal. And they're making it very difficult. We cannot let up. This is the existential issue of our time. There was a time back in 1775 where an American patriot on Bunker Hill, I believe, or maybe in Concord or Lexington, But if they want to fight, let it begin here. Let it begin here. You know, I just need to remind the audience again. The Constitution begins with the words "We the people." We the people. We're the only things that count. The government doesn't count. The government exists for us. The government is supposed to be responsive to us. The mechanisms used to control the government are set forth in the Constitution of the United States of America. And the First Amendment is the most empowering mechanism there is: free speech and a free press. If we yield on this, if we allow the Department of Justice, the FBI, the Biden administration to define what a free press is, to define what free speech is, to limit free speech, then I guess we deserve the fate we're going to get. And in this case, the fate will be the inevitability of a nuclear war, because the Biden administration, without any checks and balances, will take us straight down that path. We have to fight bad policy, but we have to fight in defense of our rights. And the defense of free speech and the defense of a free press right now are existential in nature. We cannot yield on this. We must continue to stand up and fight. I don't know how many people have been intimidated, and I have to say, myself included, by the new laws that were passed, or the new legislation that was passed, or the new sanctions that were set forth by the Department of Treasury, backed by various U.S. codes. But one of the things that they put in there is that they've sanctioned a wide range of Russian media outlets, and they've labeled them foreign missions. And there's a specific legal reason why they did that. But now what they've said is that anybody who engages with these sanctioned foreign missions and provides a goods or service, anything of value, is breaking the law. My lawyer, other lawyers have looked at this and said an interview with one of these sanctioned entities fits the definition of a good or service, not because money is exchanged, but because it becomes a thing of value for the sanctioned entity. And so they are literally breaking the law. They're literally violating the Constitution. Again, 18 U.S. Code Section 241 makes it a crime for any one person to conspire with one or more persons to violate the constitutional rights of an American, to take action to do that. The Department of Justice is literally in violation of U.S. law, because by sanctioning, because to take action, and one of the things they say is through fear and intimidation, to impede the constitutional rights of an American. Well, what is the threat of imprisonment? What is the threat of having the FBI come to your door? What is the threat of bankrupting you by making you go through a legal process that could take months, if not years? That's fear and intimidation. And the U.S. government is in violation of its own laws. I will tell you this. I mean, I don't want to predict the future and everything like that. I'm a man of limited means financially, and I'm just one person. I'm not going to let them get away with this. If they want a war, let it begin now. Let it begin here. We are at war. It's a legal war. It's a constitutional struggle, but we are at war. We have domestic enemies in the United States. I'm someone who took an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And there are domestic enemies today, and I can name them: the Department of Justice, the National Security Division of the FBI, the Biden administration itself. They're at war with the Constitution. They're at war with the American people. I'm not talking about violence. Please don't misunderstand what I'm saying. I would never support violence. What I am supporting is the rule of law. I am supporting defense of the Constitution. The U.S. government has given us a mechanism to fight back. We have a court system. It's time to take the U.S. government to task, and we need to counterattack. We don't need to sit here and let them come at us. We need to come at them, preempt their assault on the Constitution. So anybody who feels that they have been threatened by the U.S. government, intimidated by this sanctioning in a way that limits your free speech, limits your ability to speak to whom you want to, limits your ability to engage in the exercise of a free press, you might want to consider maybe making common cause with people and finding a way to make we the people a weapon against the tyranny that the Biden administration and their agencies in the U.S. government are trying to impose on us.